By mid-1967, the Byrds were in turmoil. Group's leader Roger McGuinn was at his wit's end with the group's outspoken guitarist David Crosby. In fact, McGuinn had always been at odds with Crosby. He was reluctant to even form a group with him in the first place. But after Crosby's latest escapades, things were reaching boiling point. By the end of the year, David Crosby would no longer be a Byrd. Having lost Gene Clark due to a fear of flying, stemmed by a panic attack in an airplane the year previous, they were already one member down. When the incident had occurred on the airplane, McGuinn had joked, "You can't be a Byrd if you can't fly."
And he was in a cold sweat, like terrified, shaking. He said, I can't stay on this plane. I got to get off. I got to get off. And that's when I came up. I couldn't resist the one-liner. Gene, if you can't fly, you can't be a Byrd. Well, it wasn't a funny situation, and it was very sad for him because he was totally stressed out.
During the recording of their next album, drummer Michael Clarke's inexperience would ultimately lead to his termination too. This year would see the group play the legendary Monterey Pop Festival, where David Crosby's controversial remarks on stage left the other members enraged. Michael Clarke will storm out of a session while the group record Dolphins Smile, ultimately leading to his termination. Gene Clark would temporarily rejoin the group. And by the time the album, which many consider their finest work, will be released, the group will be 3 Byrds down. This is the story of the notorious Byrd brothers.
Thank you. As I say, they will censor it, I'm sure. They can't afford to have things like that on the air. It'd blow their image.
By early 1967, rumours were circulating that the Byrds were in the midst of breaking apart. Tensions were so high, it could take just one misinterpreted look or off-the-cuff remark to spark an abusive tirade. These tirades had often turned violent. In all honesty, they were never that close. In the early days, they'd been cordial with each other, but as their fame grew, their temperament made it impossible to live harmoniously. David Crosby was pushing to be the central figure of the group. He was also pushing hard during this period for his song Lady Friend to be released as the Byrds' next single. He'd intended it to push him forward as the band's stylistic frontman. On release, the song tanked, hitting number 82 on the US Top 100. In the UK, it didn't even chart. This isn't to say the Byrds were chasing hits. How well they did in the charts was merely a gauge of their success. Their previous album had propelled them in the vastly competitive pop world. But there was no doubt this single was a step backwards. The failure of the song did nothing to discourage or soften Crosby. He would push on with his next song, Triad. Chris Hillman at this point was evolving as a songwriter. The Byrds' need for original material and the extra money through royalties had encouraged him to contribute.
And he was a talented writer. He just more or less took a back seat to the high-profile energy of Crosby and McGuinn.
The album would contain 3 songs from McGuinn, 3 songs from Crosby, 3 from Hillman, and 2 covers. As a bassist, Hillman was solid. His playing was tight and melodic. He wasn't flashy, but his work gave the songs an extra depth. His fluid melodic movement was influenced by his early days as a mandolin player. With the Byrds, he'd present his bass lines, and if it worked, the others would run with it. If McGuinn or Crosby didn't like it, they'd work out something more compatible. Throughout the sessions, the group rehearsed their songs in the studio before recording. This much to the chagrin of their label Columbia Records. They could easily eat up anywhere between 2 hours and 2 days perfecting a song. In order to utilise the time, producer Gary Usher ran sound checks and experimented with effects he may use for the song. Basically, while they rehearsed the song, Usher rehearsed the production for it. The arguments the group had were legendary. It was always McGuinn and Hillman against Crosby, with Michael Clarke not being involved. Clarke had enough trouble just keeping on beat. In most instances, producer Gary Usher would side with McGuinn and Hillman. Crosby, even by his own account, was extremely difficult to work with. On the 14th of June, recording begins with a Chris Hillman composition titled Old John Robinson. The song was inspired by a retired film director Hillman knew. During recording, Crosby switched instruments with Hillman and played bass while Hillman played guitar. This had not been planned, it was spur of the moment. When Hillman had came in to show them the song he'd written on guitar, Crosby had picked up a bass to accompany him. This musical structure would stay throughout the recording. 3 days later, following the completion of the song, the group performed their highest profile gig ever, the Monterey Pop Festival. Knowing this would be an extremely important event, the group spent a lot of time rehearsing it, something they never did. To them, the event was that important. Not only did they want to create a legendary performance, they also wanted to prove they could replicate their studio sound on stage, thus silencing critics. The concert began with Crosby's song Renaissance Fair. With a tight performance, the band got off to a great start, but after the song finished, Crosby took the mic for the first of many times and began promoting the use of LSD.
I believe that if we gave LSD to all the statesmen and politicians in the world, we might have a chance at stopping war. That's a quote from Paul McCartney.
The comments were later described by critics as totally unnecessary. Crosby shrugged it off, stating, "I probably did encourage people to drop acid. I think it's a good idea." Next, they began Chris Hillman's song, Have You Seen Her Face? When the song ends, Crosby takes the mic again.
Your mother gets high and you don't know it.
They next went through a cover of Jimi Hendrix's Hey Joe. After the song ends, Crosby takes the mic and begins talking about the JFK assassination.
I want to say it anyway, even though they will edit it out. When President Kennedy was killed, he was not killed by one man. He was shot from a number of different directions by different guns. The story has been suppressed. Witnesses have been killed. And this is your country. Ladies.
The group then perform a tight version of a traditional folk song, He Was a Friend of Mine. During the performance, a Boeing 707 came soaring over the festival site. The group continued playing over the noise, adjusting their tempo to emulate the sound of the jet as it landed in a nearby aerodrome. Unfortunately, none of this can be heard on the Monterey Pop recordings. As the song ends, Crosby thanks the audience and repeats some of his earlier statements.
Thank you. As I say, they will censor it, I'm sure. They can't afford to have things like that on the air. It'd blow their image.
They then begin with Crosby's song, Lady Friend. The group then go through a cover of Dylan's The Chimes of Freedom, with Crosby introducing the song.
We'd like to do a song for you that you never heard us do. As a matter of fact, that's mostly what we're going to do tonight. We're not going to play Tambourine Man or Turn Turn.
Finally, the set ends with the McGuinn-Hillman song, So You Wanna Be a Rock and Roll Star. Crosby again introduces.
I'd like to do something old. It's true we haven't done it in a long time, but we felt it was kind of appropriate.
When the event was over, it wasn't just the comments that upset the other Byrds. Crosby had also played on stage with the group's rivals Buffalo Springfield. In short, the group had wanted to use this event to showcase their musical ability, and Crosby had wanted to use it to assert his independence and align himself with other bands. It was clear the months ahead were going to be turbulent. On July 31st, they begin on the next track for the album, Roger McGuinn's Change Is Now. The story follows the idea of personal and societal evolution. A meditation on awakening, it urges listeners to embrace transformation. Of the song, McGuinn later described it as one of those guru spiritual mystic songs that nobody understood. They had first rehearsed the song a month earlier under the name Universal Mind Decoder, but it wasn't right. Now, they changed the tempo, which it gave the rich texture McGuinn was looking for. The song features a unique psychedelic solo from McGuinn, heavily compressed and distorted. Next, they begin on the anti-war song Draft Morning. A David Crosby composition, the story follows the morning a young man is drafted into the military. The song contrasts the peaceful morning with the horrors of war. The track begins mellow and calm and descends into chaos and gunfire before returning back. The lyric reads, "Leave my bed to kill instead." In the later sessions, after Crosby is fired from the group, McGuinn and Hillman would continue work on the song. When they came to lay down the vocals, they couldn't remember the original lyrics. With Crosby gone, they decided to rewrite them entirely. In the process, the two gave themselves a songwriting credit. When Crosby later found out, he was enraged. He felt McGuinn and Hillman had stolen his song. Despite its controversy, Draft Morning is considered one of Crosby's strongest songs from his time with the Byrds. The next track they begin was David Crosby's composition, Dolphins Smile. Crosby was already a keen sailor by this point. The ocean fascinated him. It represented a carefree existence without the burden of societal constraints. The serenity of the ocean and the longing for a carefree existence are intertwined in the song. The opening lyric reads, "Out at sea for a year, floating free from all fear." When the group entered the studio at this point, they were disintegrating. During the rehearsal session, an argument breaks out between Crosby and drummer Michael Clark. More than any of the others, Clark was tired of being in the group. He was finding it increasingly difficult to keep up with their evolving sound, especially when playing one of Crosby's songs. Crosby's compositions always relied on complicated rhythms and strange time signatures. That day, Clark simply couldn't get his head around how the beat was being emphasized.
I don't know, man. Yeah, I really don't. You do, man.
You're just, like saying that, man. If you really wanted to, you could really do it.
I mean, the first time I ever play it, right?
Oh, sure, man. I've heard you do stuff first time really good.
At first, Crosby tried to help him, but Clark was in no mood.
Well, can we give you some ideas? Instead of that fast, choppy stuff, see, it's supposed to be a long, smooth, kind of slow flowing thing, feel like a boat, not feel like horses clopping or something,
Eventually, Clark broke down, admitting he didn't like the song.
It's not beyond you, Michael. You're just, doing a
It's not
scene.
beyond me. It's just, I don't like that.
Yeah, I know. You don't like anything, man, until you get it down right, and then you like it a lot. And the only reason that you don't like it is because you haven't got it. That's always the reason, and that's always the way you do it. So why don't you instead just try to get something pretty, and then you'll like it.
The argument escalated, with Clark eventually admitting he was just there for the paycheck.
Hey, what's the matter with you? Can't you play the drums?
If you don't like me,
Don't you know how to play?
send me away and get it.
We love you. We want you to play drums right.
Send me away, man.
Oh,
Get me
they're
a
all
studio.
getting
Oh,
you
that's
tonight.
poor
Everybody's
baby.
Oh.
Oh, get him a pacifier.
What are you in the group for?
For the money.
You're not helping us make any right now. You're helping us.
After a few days, Michael Clark quit showing up altogether. Despite this, Clark will continue to tour with the group and appear in promotional videos. By this point, Crosby was losing interest in anything to do with the band. It was made clear, as with Terry Melcher, he wasn't getting on with producer Gary Usher. Also, when the group had been working on songs he didn't like, he'd just fall asleep in the studio. On August 7th, Columbia Records released a compilation album simply titled The Byrds' Greatest Hits. It sold better than their previous efforts on release and surprisingly fared well with critics. Their live performances weren't hailed the same way. Since Monterey Pop, the performances have become less and less memorable. They simply ran through their greatest hits and left the stage. Crosby later said, the live shows were so mechanical, McGuinn would refer to his watch if their set was going on too long. Of Crosby, McGuinn stated, when he was playing he'd be out of tune, but when it came to one of his songs, he'd shine. Others commented on how unprofessional Crosby was on stage, saying they'd start a song, play a few bars, then Crosby would halt proceedings for a tuning interlude. Chris Hillman would take the mic and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, the David Crosby Show." The divide between Crosby and the others was clear. Crosby on one side, McGuinn and Hillman on the other. The audience grew bored of it. 2 days later, they began on another Crosby composition titled Tribal Gathering. The song was inspired by a hippie counterculture gathering. The story describes a gathering of people from all backgrounds celebrating unity and sharing experiences. Of all the members of the Byrds, Crosby embraced the counterculture the most. He lived in a crash pad in the Hollywood Hills, believed strongly in a lifestyle free of any normal constraints.
Crosby was like Brando. He had no boundaries.
His songs were a mirror reflection of everything he believed in. Not that the other Byrds were straight-laced. Drugs played a big part in the group's sound, attitude and image. The group, now minus Michael Clarke, were on their best behaviour recording. Legendary session musician Hal Blaine took Clarke's place. They now couldn't afford to mess around. Next, they begin a David Crosby composition. Triad details a relationship between three people. The song caused arguments between the McGuinn and Hillman camp, who felt the subject matter was too controversial, and Crosby, who wrote it.
I didn't think it was appropriate for what we were doing, but he thought it was cool and hip and everything.
It just wasn't, something that they thought was in good taste, It was risque, it was out on the edge, To me, it's not out on the edge at all. It's just a love song. It has happened.
Gary Usher sided with Hillman and McGuinn simply because he felt the song was not commercial. Still, they reluctantly agreed to record the song. Afterwards, Hillman and McGuinn rejected it for the album. On September the 9th, the group returned to the studio to begin the next song, the first of two covers, titled Going Back. The song, Usher stated, was the catalyst for Crosby's dismissal.
The fun thing is that everybody thinks that that's why they threw me out of the Byrds. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not why they threw me out of the Byrds. They threw me out of the Byrds because I was an asshole.
Well, they've been recording. Columbia Records has suggested using the song, thinking it would fit the album. Columbia owned the rights to the composition as it had been published under them. They gave producer Gary Usher the song and he put it to the group. Usher had a meeting with the band and played it for the Byrds. The group were divided, with the McGuinn camp in favour and Crosby vehemently opposing. Crosby believed they should be adding their own material, not covers, and was pushing for his own song, namely Triad, to be on the record. Usher gave it a bit of time and then later played the song again for them, with Hillman and McGuinn again in favour and Crosby unwavering. Usher rarely pushed material on the group as he knew they had three great songwriters and their material by this point was strong, but he really felt this would fit well on the album. Crosby agreed the group could record it, but without him. He would be no part of it. He felt maybe this would dissuade them, but it didn't. They went ahead with it. When all was finished, Crosby listened back and hated it. He began slating the song.
And one day Crosby walked in the studio and listened to it and made some kind of comment about that really sucks or something like that. He thought the song was very wimpy.
This was the straw that broke the camel's back. McGuinn went berserk at him and told him he was sick of Crosby's attitude and the Byrds didn't need him.
McGuinn got to a point where he just couldn't take anymore, and finally he said, "Look at Crosby, I've had enough of your bullshit. If you don't want to work on a song and be a part of the group, and just get your ass out of here. We don't want you. We don't even need you. Frankly, we've had enough of your FF attitude. Probably better for the group if you just put your effing F-word ego out of here and somewhere else." Well, that did it. Crosby, his face turned red. He picked his guitar up and just walked right out of the studio and never came back. Anyway, after he walked out of the studio, and I remember McGuinn saying, "Good, it's about time that asshole left anyway."
A few days later, when the group played in San Francisco, Crosby stayed in a separate hotel. McGuinn and Hillman now realised they couldn't go forward like this. Hillman stated in his biography, it's not something they wanted to do, but David had to go. The two drove to his house in Beverly Green and officially fired him from the group. Crosby later recounted the story, saying they came zooming up in two Porsches, told him he was impossible to work with and they'd do much better without him. Hillman later stated Crosby was surprised by the decision. McGuinn later stated firing him may have been a rash decision, but he was simply impossible to work with. With Crosby gone, 3 changes happened to pick up the slack. Clarence White, who worked on their previous records, was brought to fill in. Gary Usher added more creative input, and Gene Clark rejoined the group. On October 20th, Going Back was released as the Byrds' next single, and they were booked to promote it on the Smothers Brothers show. The problem was, they now had a three-piece band. They needed a fill-in, and Gene Clark agreed for old time's sake. McGuinn phoned Clark and asked him if he could fly. He told McGuinn, "Yes, I can," and so Gene Clark was a Byrd again. Clark would fly, even if it meant him barely conscious on tranquilizers to take the flight. The original lineup, minus Crosby, performed Mr. Spaceman and Going Back. During the performance, Clark appears shaken and uncomfortable. He was really a shell of his former self on stage. Days after, they played an out-of-town gig, but Clark's old anxieties reached a peak. The flight was booked, but Gene Clark opted to take the train. It became clear to everyone it wasn't going to work out. On the morning they were to board a flight to New York, Clark freaked out. He refused to board the plane, visibly shaken and distraught. Then, he took the train home. Of his 3 weeks in the Byrds, Hillman later stated he'd gone almost as soon as he'd arrived. As for the single, it would tank even worse than Crosby's Lady Friend. Commercially, it was the worst single the Byrds ever released, peaking at number 89 and not even charting in the UK. 3 days later, the group began recording what would be the closing track for the album, Roger McGuinn's Space Odyssey. The story was a retelling of the book that inspired the Stanley Kubrick film 2001: A Space Odyssey. The Moog synthesizer was used throughout to give an otherworldly effect. The song actually predates the film, which was released 3 months after the album. Roger McGuinn was both fascinated by science fiction and had a deep interest in space exploration. The song stays true to the book, where the space explorers find a pyramid on the moon. Musically, it follows a simple chord structure with heavy use of McGuinn's Moog synthesizer. November 13th, the group begin on their next song, a Roger McGuinn composition, Get To You. It details a man travelling to England in anticipation and longing to reconcile with someone. The song switches time signatures, dropping to a waltz, giving a dreamlike effect. It was around this time the cover photo for the album was taken. It was shot at an old abandoned stone house in Topanga Canyon. Topanga Canyon was known for horseback riding in the 1960s. The area had trails winding through the Santa Monica Mountains, making it a popular spot for riders. Horseback riding was part of the bohemian rustic lifestyle that attracted artists, musicians, and counterculture figures to Topanga. Chris Hillman, in fact, had done a lot of horseback riding there and suggested the location. The 3 remaining Byrds were pictured looking through the window where Crosby's space a horse looks through. It hadn't been planned though. Drummer Michael Clark had just brought his horse into the house, and it was spur of the moment they shot the photos of the horse. Despite popular belief, there was no conscious effort to show Crosby as a horse, but when they looked back at the pictures, they realised it appeared that way, much to their amusement. Whether the horse represented Crosby, McGuinn and Hillman are still asked to this day. Hillman once said, "In truth, maybe so, but not intentionally." Not long after, Michael Clark announced he was leaving the band. He was disillusioned and burnt out. The others are still unclear to exactly why he left to this day. On the 29th of November, they began on Chris Hillman's composition, Natural Harmony. Similar to Going Back, the story yearns for the innocence of youth, along with peace and unity. Unlike Going Back though, it's more psychedelic, hinting at drugs being the catalyst for the spiritual awakening. Artificial energy. The song was a commentary on amphetamine use. Chris Hillman has suggested writing a song about speed. The story follows a man high on amphetamines who's imprisoned for killing a homosexual man. The title had been suggested previously by Michael Clark. It was, in fact, enough to secure him a songwriting credit. It was the first time the group outright referenced a drug in their compositions. Michael Clark returns to drum on the track and has never sounded better. The recording sessions had begun with the group as a 4-piece band, but by the time the notorious Byrd Brothers was released, just Hillman and McGuinn remained. Crosby and McGuinn were polar opposites in personality. Musically, they also pushed in opposite directions. While McGuinn put forward Going Back, a track that detailed a yearning to recapture youthful innocence, Crosby put forward Triad, a song promoting indulgence and personal freedom. The group were like a band of brothers who both loved and hated each other. Though critically acclaimed, the experimental album fared much worse in the charts than their previous effort. It peaked at number 47. Their next album would see a dramatic change in style. It wouldn't even chart in the UK and would peak at number 77 in the US. It alienated many of their fan base and signalled the beginning of a commercial decline. The notorious Byrd brothers was the end of an era for the Byrds. They'd now disintegrated and split apart. Though the original lineup would regroup 6 years later for their final album, this was the end of the Byrds as we knew them. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, and if you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated. Just click the three symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and choose however much you wish to donate. Everything donated goes directly back into the channel to make better quality videos. As always, thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next video.